February 13th, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander Masajiro Kawato's hand trembled slightly as he read the combat intelligence brief, not from fear, but from suppressed laughter that echoed through the cramped operations tent. The Americans, it seemed, had designed another fighter. This one, according to captured technical documents, possessed wings so long they had to fold for carrier storage, an engine so massive it required a nose longer than some entire Japanese fighters, and a landing gear so tall the aircraft sat at an angle that made taxiing dangerous. "They call it the Corsair," he read aloud to his assembled pilots, his voice dripping with contempt. "Our intelligence analysts report it so difficult to land on carriers that the American Navy has rejected it for shipboard use. They've given it to the Marines, their ground forces. It's a land-based fighter pretending to be naval aviation." The tent erupted in laughter. Through the open flaps, Kawato could see his squadron's Mitsubishi A6M0s lined up in their revetments, their elegant lines speaking to a design philosophy perfected over years of combat. For 18 months, these aircraft had dominated Pacific skies with a grace and lethality that had shattered Allied air power from Pearl Harbor to the Solomon Islands. The British had lost their Prince of Wales and Repulse to Japanese naval aviation. The Americans had seen their fortress of the Philippines fall. The Dutch East Indies had collapsed in weeks. And now, this ungainly creation, this Corsair, rejected by its own navy, was supposed to challenge Japanese air superiority. What Kawato didn't know, what none of the battle-hardened Japanese naval aviators gathered in that sweltering tent could have imagined, was that in exactly 47 days, this rejected, awkward, seemingly flawed fighter would begin a reign of terror so absolute that Japanese pilots would come to call it the Whistling Death. The Vought F-4U Corsair would achieve a kill ratio of 11-1, destroying over 2,000 Japanese aircraft while fundamentally transforming the nature of fighter combat in the Pacific. It would prove faster than any Japanese fighter, more heavily armed than anything in the Imperial arsenal, and capable of performance that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Within 6 months, veteran Japanese aces with dozens of victories would be writing farewell letters home before missions, knowing that encountering Corsairs meant facing an enemy that combined overwhelming firepower with speed that made escape impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The supremacy assumption had concrete foundations. Since December 7th, 1941, Japanese naval aviation had compiled victory statistics that seemed to defy mathematical probability. At Pearl Harbor, they had lost 29 aircraft while destroying or disabling 347 American planes. In the Philippines campaign, Japanese losses numbered 7 aircraft against 103 destroyed. Over Darwin, Australia, 2 Japanese planes fell, while 30 Allied aircraft burned. The campaigns in Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma had followed the same pattern, crushing Japanese victories achieved at minimal cost. The weapon that had delivered this dominance was the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that represented a revolutionary approach to fighter design. When American technical intelligence officers first examined captured Zeros in 1942, they initially refused to believe their measurements. The aircraft seemed to violate fundamental principles of aeronautical engineering. A fighter shouldn't possess the range of a medium bomber, the turning radius of a biplane, and sufficient firepower to destroy heavy aircraft. Yet the Zero accomplished all three, creating a weapon that had no equal in early Pacific combat. Petty Officer First Class Takeo Tanemizu, who would eventually record 42 confirmed victories before his death in 1944, wrote extensively about the Zero in his personal journal, portions of which were recovered after the war. The Zero is not merely an aircraft, it is an extension of the pilot's spirit. Western fighters are built like their automobiles, heavy, crude, relying on brute force. The Zero is built like a samurai sword, light, perfectly balanced, requiring skill to wield properly but deadly beyond measure in trained hands. The Americans build fighters for average pilots. We build fighters for superior pilots. This will always be our advantage. This philosophy manifested in every aspect of the Zero's design. Its structure utilized extra superduralumin, a classified aluminum alloy that provided strength at 30% less weight than comparable American materials. The aircraft carried no armor protection for the pilot, considering such additions an insult to warrior spirit and an unnecessary weight penalty. Self-sealing fuel tanks, standard on American fighters, were rejected as adding mass that degraded performance. Even the radio equipment was often removed from operational Zeros, saving an additional £30 that could be invested in maneuverability. The result was an aircraft of extraordinary capability. With a wing loading of just £22 per square foot, the Zero could execute a complete 360-degree turn in approximately 612 feet of radius. Its combat radius extended to 1,700 miles, allowing it to escort bombers on missions that American fighters couldn't dream of matching. In the hands of Japan's superbly trained pre-war pilots, men who had completed 3-year training programs and entered combat with 700 hours of flight time, the Zero had seemed invincible. The first Corsair rumors began, filtering through Japanese intelligence channels in late 1942. The reports seemed contradictory, almost deliberately planted as disinformation. An American fighter with an engine producing 2,000 horsepower, a top speed allegedly exceeding 400 miles per hour, armament consisting of 6 50-caliber machine guns, a loaded weight of over 14,000 pounds. The specifications were shared at a staff meeting at Rabaul in January 1943, preserved in Japanese Southeast Area Fleet Archives. Captain Tadashi Nakajima, operations officer for the 11th Air Fleet, provided the official assessment that would guide Japanese tactical thinking for the critical months ahead. The Americans continue their failed approach of using engine power to compensate for pilot inadequacy. This Corsair, if these specifications are accurate, represents the ultimate expression of this philosophy. An aircraft weighing more than twice our Zero, powered by an engine, our industry cannot replicate, attempting to overcome superior Japanese training and tactics through brute mechanical force. The fundamental flaw remains. In a turning engagement, weight is a liability, not an asset. Our pilots will exploit this, as they have exploited every heavy American fighter that has challenged Japanese air superiority. The mathematics seemed incontrovertible. The Zero's maximum speed of 331 miles per hour was adequate for intercepting bombers. Its climbing performance of 3,000 feet per minute matched or exceeded most Allied fighters. Its turning radius was unmatched. In every combat that mattered, in the dogfight where pilot skill and aircraft agility determined survival, the Zero held every advantage. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp, what their tactical doctrine couldn't accommodate, was that the Corsair wasn't designed to fight the Zero's fight. It was designed to make the traditional dogfight obsolete. Lieutenant Warren D. Curtin, one of the first Marine pilots to transition to the Corsair in late 1942, recorded his initial impressions in letters that would later be preserved in the National Archives. They brought us into the hangar and showed us the F-4U for the first time. My immediate thought was that someone had made a terrible mistake. The thing looked like it had been designed by 3 different committees who never spoke to each other. The nose stretched forward like a railroad tunnel, the wings bent in the middle like a seagull's. The cockpit sat so far back you couldn't see the ground in front of you. When they told us this was supposed to be carrier-capable, half the pilots laughed out loud. It looked like the most un-naval aircraft ever conceived. Then they started the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial produced a sound unlike anything we'd heard before, not the smooth purr of inline engines or the buzz of smaller radials. This was a deep, rumbling roar that vibrated your chest from 30 feet away. 2,000 horsepower. At that moment, laughing stopped. We understood we were looking at something fundamentally different. The Corsair's development had been fraught with problems that validated Japanese dismissiveness. The aircraft's long nose created visibility issues that made carrier landings extraordinarily dangerous. The stall characteristics were unpredictable, with the left wing tending to drop without warning. The cockpit position, set far aft to balance the massive engine, gave pilots virtually no forward visibility during the critical moments of carrier approach. By late 1942, the Navy had indeed restricted Corsair carrier operations, assigning the type primarily to Marine Corps land-based squadrons. To Japanese observers monitoring American aviation developments, this appeared to confirm their assessment. The Americans had built a fighter too flawed for their own carriers. What they failed to understand was that the Marines were about to turn the Corsair's supposed flaws into overwhelming advantages. The power plant at the Corsair's heart represented American industrial capability at its peak. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 produced 2,050 horsepower at takeoff, with war emergency power pushing output to 2,250 horsepower. This was 700 horsepower more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine could generate, but raw power was only part of the equation. The R2800 had been designed with reliability as a primary specification. Every component was built to exacting tolerances, using materials that Japanese industry simply couldn't replicate at scale. The engine could run at maximum power for extended periods without failure. It could absorb significant battle damage and continue operating. It incorporated features like automatic mixture control and constant speed propellers that reduced pilot workload and maximized performance. Japanese mechanics examining captured Corsair engines after the war would find the engineering both impressive and depressing. The precision machining, the interchangeability of parts, the sophisticated metallurgy, all represented industrial capabilities that Japan had never possessed. The armament installation on the Corsair embodied American firepower philosophy. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons and 375 rounds for the middle and outboard guns. Total ammunition load, 2,350 rounds. Rate of fire, 750 rounds per minute per gun, 4,500 rounds per minute combined. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and left the muzzle at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of energy at impact. The concentration of this firepower was devastating. Corsair guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, creating a cone of destruction approximately 6 feet in diameter. An enemy aircraft entering this cone would be hit by multiple projectiles simultaneously, each capable of penetrating armor plate, severing control cables, igniting fuel tanks, or destroying engine components. Lieutenant Colonel Harold W. Bauer, who would earn the Medal of Honor flying Corsairs before his death in November 1942, described the armament in his tactical reports. You don't aim at specific components with the Corsair. You point at the enemy aircraft and press the trigger. The volume of fire is so dense that something critical will be hit. I've seen Zeros literally disintegrate under concentrated fire from all 6 guns. 2-second bursts are usually sufficient. Anything longer is overkill. Compare this to the Zero's armament. 2 7.7mm machine guns, firing projectiles weighing 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second, delivering 750 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero also carried 2 20mm cannons, but these weapons had limited ammunition, just 60 rounds per gun, and a slow rate of fire. Japanese pilots had to be precise, aiming carefully to conserve ammunition. Corsair pilots could afford to be overwhelming. The structural engineering of the Corsair reflected lessons learned from early Pacific combat. The aircraft incorporated armor protection totaling 212 pounds, including plates behind the pilot's seat, around the oil cooler, and protecting critical flight control systems. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, capable of absorbing multiple hits without catastrophic fuel loss. The airframe itself was stressed to handle loads up to 6.5 Gs positive and 3 Gs negative, with safety margins that meant the aircraft could exceed these limits in combat emergencies without structural failure. This ruggedness meant Corsairs could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter Japanese fighters. Combat reports consistently documented Corsairs returning to base with damage that would have been fatal to a Zero. Holes in wings and fuselage, damaged control surfaces, engine components shot away, yet the aircraft remained controllable and its pilot alive. Warrant Officer Kunimori Nakakariya, a Japanese ace with 19 victories who survived the war, wrote in his post-war memoirs about the shock of watching Corsairs absorb damage. "We would make perfect deflection shots, see our rounds striking the enemy aircraft, watch pieces fly off, then the Corsair would simply continue flying as if nothing had happened. It was as if we were fighting armoured creatures, not aircraft." Our 20mm cannon shells, which would tear a Zero apart, seemed to bounce off Corsairs. We began to understand we were not fighting an aircraft. We were fighting an industrial philosophy that could afford to protect its pilots with weight we could never carry. The tactical doctrine that accompanied the Corsair into combat represented a complete reimagining of fighter operations. Rather than attempting to outturn enemy fighters, Corsair pilots were trained to exploit their aircraft's overwhelming advantages in speed, climb rate, and firepower through a technique called boom and zoom. The concept was elegantly simple. Corsairs would establish an altitude advantage, often patrolling at 20,000 feet or higher, where their supercharged engines still produced full power, while Japanese engines struggled in the thin air. When enemy aircraft were spotted below, Corsairs would dive at full power, reaching speeds that no Japanese fighter could match. At over 400 miles per hour in a dive, the Corsair would slash through enemy formations, guns firing in short, devastating bursts. Before Japanese pilots could react, the Corsairs would use their excess speed to zoom climb back to altitude, converting velocity into height faster than any enemy aircraft could follow. If a Japanese pilot attempted pursuit, climbing at maximum power trying to stay with the Corsair, he would watch his airspeed decay as his engine laboured against gravity. At the point where the Zero approached stall speed, the Corsair would still be climbing strongly. A simple hammerhead turn or wingover would position the Corsair behind and above the now helpless Zero. Japanese pilots called this tactic the Devil's Yo-Yo, watching helplessly as Corsairs bounced up and down through their formations, killing with each pass while remaining untouchable. Major Gregory Boyington, who would become famous as Pappy Boyington leading the Black Sheep Squadron, explained the doctrine in his characteristic blunt style during pilot training sessions. "Forget everything you learned about dogfighting. You do not turn with Japanese fighters, ever. You use speed, you use altitude, you use firepower. You are flying a 2-ton bullet powered by 2,000 horses. You point that bullet at the enemy, shoot him, and get the hell out before his friends arrive. Anyone who tries to turn fight in a Corsair will be dead within a week." This philosophy required discipline that went against every fighter pilot's instinct. When an enemy aircraft appeared on your tail, every instinct screamed to brake hard, to pull the aircraft into a desperate turn. Corsair pilots were trained to do the opposite, push the throttle forward and dive away, using speed to escape, then climb back to regain advantage. The key was never surrendering energy, never allowing the fight to devolve into a slow-speed turning contest where the Zero's advantages could manifest. This demanded not just discipline but trust in the aircraft and tactics. It meant deliberately flying away from enemies, exposing your tail, relying on speed and armour to survive. For pilots trained in traditional fighter doctrine, this felt like cowardice. For those who mastered it, it became systematic execution. The human equation began unravelling for Japanese aviation in ways that transcended simple aircraft performance comparisons. By mid-1944, the Imperial Navy's pilot training infrastructure had collapsed under the combined weight of fuel shortages, instructor casualties, and desperate operational demands. Where pre-war naval aviators had received 3 years of rigorous training totaling 700 flight hours before their first combat mission, pilots now arrived at frontline squadrons with as little as 100 hours total flight time. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target. Some had never flown in formation at night. A significant percentage had never experienced actual combat maneuvers against a thinking opponent. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace who had survived despite losing an eye to American gunfire in 1942, returned to training duties in early 1944 at Omura Naval Air Station. His personal diary, preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, contains entries that read like obituaries written in advance. Today, I watched Ensign Hamada attempt carrier landing practice. He has 47 hours total flight time. 47 hours. I had 400 hours before I saw my first carrier deck. He will face Corsair pilots with 300 hours minimum, men who have fired 10,000 practice rounds, who have practiced energy tactics until they are instinctive. I am sending children to fight professionals, and I know with certainty that most will not survive their first week. The mathematics are not mathematics. They are murder. The fuel crisis had become so severe that advanced students practiced aerobatics in gliders, towed aloft by older aircraft, released to simulate combat maneuvers without burning precious gasoline. Gunnery training was limited to 20 rounds per student. Radio procedure, instrument flying, navigation training, all were curtailed or eliminated entirely. The Japanese training command was producing pilots who could barely fly their aircraft, let alone fight in them. Meanwhile, American pilot production had become an industrial process as refined as aircraft manufacturing. Training bases across the United States operated around the clock. Pilot candidates progressed through primary training in simple aircraft, advanced training in complex planes, then type-specific training in the exact aircraft they would fly in combat. By the time a Marine pilot climbed into a Corsair in the Pacific, he had already accumulated dozens of hours in that specific aircraft type. He had practiced gunnery until hitting moving targets became automatic. He had flown formation through weather, executed tactical maneuvers against instructors playing enemy aircraft, learned emergency procedures until they were muscle memory. The contrast wasn't just in quantity, but in quality. American pilots were professionals, Japanese pilots, by 1944, were desperate amateurs thrown into meat grinders. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated this disparity with mathematical brutality. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa committed Japan's reconstituted carrier force to Operation Eigo, the decisive battle that would supposedly destroy American naval power in the Pacific. 9 Japanese carriers launched 450 aircraft, including their best remaining pilots and newest aircraft variants. Against them stood Task Force 58, with 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, including over 400 Corsairs and Hellcats. The engagement that followed became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured both the one-sided nature of the combat and the almost casual ease with which Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Corsair and Hellcat pilots, guided to their targets by radar-equipped fighter direction officers who could track Japanese formations from over 100 miles away, established textbook ambush positions. They waited at altitude with the sun behind them, engines throttled back to conserve fuel, watching as Japanese formations climbed toward them in perfect visibility. When the order came to engage, American fighters dove in coordinated sections, their energy tactics rehearsed so thoroughly that execution required minimal radio communication. The slaughter was systematic. First Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh, flying with Marine Fighting Squadron 124, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on June 19th alone, bringing his total to 21 confirmed victories. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Harry Hollowell, destroyed 4. Their division of 4 Corsairs accounted for 14 Japanese aircraft without loss. This pattern repeated across the entire engagement area. Across 2 days of combat, Japanese losses reached catastrophic proportions. Of 450 carrier aircraft committed, 346 were destroyed. An additional 50 land-based aircraft were shot down. American losses totaled 30 aircraft from all causes, with many pilots rescued by submarine and destroyer pickets positioned specifically for that purpose. The kill ratio exceeded 10-1. More significantly, Japan lost not just aircraft but pilots who could never be replaced. The training infrastructure no longer existed to create their equivalents. Major Gregory Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, officially Marine Fighting Squadron 214, exemplified the Corsair's dominance during this period. Operating from primitive airstrips in the Solomon Islands, often flying multiple missions per day in aircraft that showed the wear of constant combat operations, the Black Sheep compiled a record that seemed impossible. In 84 days of combat operations, the squadron claimed 114 confirmed aerial victories. Boyington personally claimed 28, making him the Marine Corps' leading ace. The human story behind these statistics revealed the Corsair's true impact. Japanese pilots who had survived early encounters with Corsairs developed what American intelligence officers termed Corsair psychosis. The sound of the Corsair's approach, a distinctive whistling created by air flowing over the oil coolers in the wing roots, became a harbinger of death that triggered panic reactions even in experienced pilots. Warrant Officer Yasuo Kuwahara, who survived the war and later emigrated to the United States, described this psychological impact in his memoir. "We called them whistling death because you heard them before you saw them. That sound, that terrible whistling shriek as they dove, meant someone was about to die. Usually several of us. I watched the Corsair kill my friends one after another. Not in dramatic dogfights, not in fair combat. They would appear above us, dive at speeds we couldn't match, fire those 6 terrible guns for 2 or 3 seconds, then climb away before we could even turn toward them. By mid-1944, hearing that whistle made my hands shake on the control stick. This was not cowardice. This was mathematics. The probability of surviving an encounter with Corsairs approached 0. The kamikaze transformation represented Japan's ultimate admission that conventional air combat against aircraft like the Corsair had become impossible. If Japanese pilots could no longer survive long enough to shoot down American aircraft, they could at least crash into American ships before being killed. The mathematics were brutally simple. A conventionally attacking Zero had perhaps a 5% chance of successfully delivering its payload and returning to base. A kamikaze attack had a 30% chance of hitting a target, and the pilot's death was guaranteed either way. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, justified the transformation in a speech to pilots in October 1944, portions of which were recorded and later transcribed. Japan's survival depends upon the success of the attack against the enemy fleet. If we cannot win through conventional combat, we must win through spirit and sacrifice. You have trained as warriors, now you will serve as weapons. Your aircraft will become bombs guided by the most sophisticated guidance system ever created, the human mind and spirit. By 1945, the kamikaze program consumed virtually all Japanese pilot production. Young men with barely 50 hours of flight time were given rudimentary training in takeoff and basic navigation, then loaded into aircraft, stripped of everything except explosives and fuel for a one-way mission. The Corsair's role evolved to meet this desperate new threat. During the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945, Corsairs flew combat air patrol missions around the American fleet, their sole purpose to intercept kamikaze aircraft before they reached the ships. The mathematics became even more lopsided. Kamikaze pilots, many of whom could barely control their aircraft in level flight, had no chance whatsoever against Corsair pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. Yet the sheer numbers of attackers meant that some inevitably got through. Captain Kenneth A. Walsh, by now an ace many times over, described the psychological weight of this combat in post-war interviews. Fighting kamikazes was different from any other air combat. These weren't pilots trying to survive. They were bombs with cockpits. You'd shoot one down, watch it explode or cartwheel into the ocean, and feel no satisfaction because 10 more were coming behind it. We killed them by the dozens, but it never felt like victory. It felt like slaughter, which it was. These kids could barely fly. They came straight and level, easy targets, and we shot them down before they knew we were there. In combat terms, it was a massacre. In human terms, it was a tragedy. The technological gulf by war's end had become unbridgeable. The F-4U-4 variant Corsair incorporated improvements that made an already dominant aircraft even more lethal. Water injection systems boosted the R2800W engine to 2,450 horsepower for combat emergencies. The aircraft could reach 446 miles per hour in level flight. Climb rate exceeded 4,000 feet per minute. New gun sights with computing capability calculated deflection automatically, making accurate shooting almost trivial. Major Robert M. Hansen, operating with Marine Fighting Squadron 215, demonstrated the late-war Corsair's capabilities during operations over Rabaul in early 1944. In 17 days of combat, Hansen shot down 25 Japanese aircraft, earning the Medal of Honor before his death in February 1944, when his Corsair was hit by ground fire during a strafing run. His combat reports describe encounters that weren't dogfights, but executions. The Japanese aircraft we're facing now are flown by pilots who don't know basic fighter tactics. They fly straight. They don't use altitude. They don't understand energy management. Engaging them feels less like combat and more like target practice. The Corsair gives us such overwhelming advantages that the outcome is predetermined before the first shot. This isn't a critique of our tactics or their courage. It's simple reality. We're flying superior aircraft and we're better trained. The combination is insurmountable. The industrial dimension of Corsair dominance extended beyond the aircraft itself to the entire support infrastructure. Vought Aircraft and its licensees, Goodyear and Brewster, produced 12,571 Corsairs during the war. At peak production, new aircraft rolled off assembly lines at a rate of 1 every 90 minutes. This production included not just airframes, but complete logistical systems, spare engines, replacement parts, ammunition, specialized tools, technical manuals, maintenance training programs. Japanese industry, by contrast, was collapsing. Raw material shortages meant aircraft were built with increasingly inferior materials. Aluminum alloys were substituted with steel, adding weight and reducing performance. Quality control deteriorated as experienced workers were conscripted and replaced with untrained laborers. By 1945, Japanese aircraft coming off production lines often required extensive rework before they could fly. Some were so poorly built they were dangerous to their own pilots. The strategic transformation enabled by the Corsair fundamentally altered Pacific War dynamics. With fighters capable of providing effective combat air patrol over the fleet for hours, American carriers became mobile fortresses that could operate with near impunity off enemy coastlines. The concept of the Alpha Strike, launching massive, coordinated attacks of bombers escorted by overwhelming fighter coverage, became standard operating procedure. Japanese defenders would vector every available fighter to intercept these raids, only to be systematically destroyed by Corsairs and Hellcats before bombers even reached their targets. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, understood this transformation completely. His operational orders for the invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945 reflected absolute confidence in American air superiority. We will maintain continuous combat air patrol over the fleet. We will launch strikes against Japanese airfields at will. We will operate as though enemy air power does not exist, because effectively, it does not. The Corsair and Hellcat have made our carriers invulnerable to any air attack Japan can mount. The personal testimonies of Japanese pilots who survived the war reveal the psychological devastation of facing overwhelming technological superiority. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, who remarkably survived the entire war despite multiple severe wounds, provided perhaps the most honest assessment in his autobiography, published in 1957. The Corsair destroyed not just our aircraft but our confidence, our doctrine, our entire philosophy of air combat. We had believed that superior spirit and superior training could overcome material disadvantages. The Corsair proved this belief was a comfortable lie. Spirit cannot defeat 650 caliber machine guns. Training cannot overcome an aircraft that can dive away from any threat at speeds you cannot match. The samurai tradition emphasizes facing death with dignity. The Corsair made such dignity impossible. You died from behind, shot down before you could even see your killer, or you watched your friends die while you were helpless to intervene. This wasn't war, as we understood it. This was industrial extermination. The final accounting reveals numbers that tell a story of complete dominance. The F-4U Corsair destroyed 2,140 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat, lost only 189 aircraft to enemy fighters, achieved a kill ratio of 11.3 to 1 in the Pacific Theater, produced 122 Marine and Navy aces who flew the type, and accounted for 64% of all Marine Corps aerial victories. These statistics represent not just tactical success, but strategic transformation. The Corsair enabled operational concepts that would have been impossible with earlier fighters. Extended range meant carriers could launch strikes from beyond Japanese land-based aircraft range. Superior performance meant American pilots could choose when and how to engage. Overwhelming firepower meant brief engagements produced decisive results. The cultural collision embedded in the Corsair story transcends simple technological comparison. Japanese aviation doctrine emphasized qualities that made sense in 1941. Individual pilot excellence, aircraft maneuverability, acceptance of risk, and glorification of offensive spirit. These values produced early war victories against opponents who were unprepared, undertrained, or flying obsolete equipment. The Corsair represented a different philosophy entirely. American doctrine emphasized systematic advantages, superior aircraft protecting their pilots, overwhelming firepower, eliminating the need for precision, energy tactics that refused fair fights, and industrial production that made losses replaceable. This wasn't cowardice or lack of warrior spirit, it was simply more effective. The question wasn't which philosophy was more noble, the question was, which philosophy won? The Corsair answered that question definitively. In 1964, the United States Naval Institute hosted a symposium on Pacific War aviation. American and Japanese veterans gathered to discuss the conflict with the perspective that 2 decades of peace provides. The exchange between Major Gregory Boyington and Lieutenant Commander Masajiro Kawato, who had survived the war despite being shot down 3 times, captured the essential truth. Boyington spoke first, his characteristic bluntness softened slightly by age and reflection. The Corsair won the air war in the Pacific. Not because American pilots were braver, Japanese pilots showed extraordinary courage, often suicidal courage. Not because we wanted victory more. Both sides were fighting for their nations and their comrades. We won because we had better tools and better systems. War isn't about fair fights. It's about making the fight as unfair as possible in your favor. The Corsair made every fight unfair. Kawato's response, translated from Japanese, carried the weight of painful self-awareness. We mocked the Corsair because we didn't understand what we were mocking. We saw an ungainly aircraft that our Navy had rejected for carrier use. We failed to see an industrial, democracy's ability to protect its warriors, to give them advantages that made their survival possible. The Zero was an elegant weapon that required its pilot to be exceptional. The Corsair was an effective weapon that allowed average pilots to be deadly. When the exceptional died, and we all died eventually, Japan had no way to replace us. When American pilots died, they were replaced by equally well-trained pilots in identical aircraft within days. We were trying to win a modern war with medieval philosophy. By the time we understood this, understanding came too late. The mathematics had already spoken. The final word belongs to the men who flew and fought, whose experiences transcend statistics and tactical analysis. Second Lieutenant Robert R. Klingman of Marine Fighting Squadron 312 encountered a situation in May 1945 that perfectly captured the Corsair's capability. At 38,000 feet over Japan, far above the altitude where most aircraft could function effectively, Klingman engaged a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. His guns froze in the thin, cold air. Undeterred, Klingman maneuvered his Corsair alongside the enemy aircraft and physically chopped off its rudder with his propeller, sending it into an uncontrollable spin. He then flew his damaged Corsair back to Okinawa and landed safely. The incident was so improbable that it required multiple witness confirmations before being officially credited. Yet it happened because the Corsair's structural strength and pilot protection allowed such aggressive tactics to be survivable. The legacy of the Corsair extends far beyond World War II. The aircraft remained in frontline service through the Korean War, where it proved equally dominant against North Korean and Chinese forces. The final combat sortie by a piston-engine fighter in American military service was flown by a Corsair in 1953. The type served with foreign air forces into the 1960s. Its combat record remains unmatched among American fighters. But the deeper legacy lies in what the Corsair represented. It proved that systematic advantages compound into overwhelming superiority, that protecting your warriors enables them to develop expertise through survival, that industrial capacity, properly applied, becomes a weapon as deadly as any gun or bomb. The Japanese pilots who mocked the Corsair in early 1943 weren't stupid or blind. They were making assessments based on doctrine that had proven successful for 18 months of continuous victory. What they couldn't see was that the war had fundamentally changed. The period when superior pilot training could overcome material disadvantages had ended. The Corsair, with its massive engine, heavy firepower, protective armor, and systematic tactical employment, represented the future of air combat. The Zero, elegant and deadly in skilled hands but fragile and replaceable only with inferior pilots, represented a past that could not survive contact with industrial-age warfare. When the final surrender came in August 1945, dozens of Corsairs from various marine squadrons flew over Tokyo Bay as part of the aerial display accompanying the ceremony aboard USS Missouri. Japanese officers watching from shore or from the surrender delegation itself saw aircraft that had become symbols of their defeat. Not because the Corsair was prettier or more maneuverable than the Zero, because it was more effective, more survivable, more numerous, and employed by better supported pilots within a superior system. The laughter of early 1943, when Japanese pilots had dismissed this awkward, carrier-rejected fighter, had long since died in the throats of those few who survived to remember it. The Corsair had earned its nickname, Whistling Death, through simple, brutal mathematics. It had killed over 2,000 Japanese aircraft. It had enabled American victory in the Pacific Air War, and it had proven, beyond any possible counter-argument, that modern warfare rewards not the most elegant weapon, but the most effective system. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.